everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Dustin Lewis, and I'm the Research Director for Harvard Law School's program on international law and armed conflict. I'm thrilled to be here tonight with all of you for us to have the opportunity to hear some very interesting research from Professor Ingvild Bode and Dr. Anna Nadabaidze. I'm trying so hard, and I'm not succeeding, but I will get closer. So we're going to have an hour. It'll be a half-hour presentation, followed by question and answer. This is being recorded and will be broadcast afterwards. And a quick background on the speakers. Dr. Ingvild Bode is a professor of international relations at the University of Southern Denmark and is the director of the Center for War Studies and has published quite extensively, and her bio is available online. And Dr. Anna Nadabaidze is a researcher for the European Research Council, funded AutoNorms, an auto practices project, which happens also to be based at the Center for War Studies at the University of Southern Denmark. And I'm very excited to hear their most recent research insights. And without further ado, I will hand the floor over to you.
Thank you so much. I should be using that. So thank you so much, Dustin. Whoops. Am I supposed to do anything with that? No, just to make sure I don't switch it on. Okay. Thank you so much, Dustin, for having us and for inviting us. I'm very, very happy to talk to you today about our research project. So I think our presentation will really come in two parts. So we'll first introduce a bit the broader project that this research is part of. So this is the European Research Council funded project AutoNorms, and then we'll go through kind of some of our theoretical thinking around how we think norms on AI in the military domain are shaping up at the moment, illustrating some of the significance of that through two examples of particular systems integrating AI technologies. And then we'll end with a reflection on the prospects for the global governance of AI in the military domain. So the AutoNorms project is funded by the European Research Council and has been going on for the past 4 years. So which means we're in a good stage of the project to actually talking about and sharing substantive findings. So I've led in the past 4 years a team of 4 researchers to address the basic question of how do autonomous weapon systems change international norms on the use of force. And I should maybe preface this because I realize I'm speaking to a legal audience. So we are political scientists. So our understanding of norms actually goes a bit beyond legal norms. So we're also going to be talking about social norms, right? And I will come back to that in a couple of slides' time. And the project then tracks practices across various social contexts of use or of developing these systems in China, Japan, Russia, and the US. As you can see from this, I think the question of how to govern AI systems or AI and weapon systems has increased in salience over the last 10 years quite significantly. Because if you just look at, for example, this year or also 2023, we've had multiple calls to kind of finally regulate military applications of AI from all kinds of different parts of the globe, really, right? So and these are just a couple of actors who have voiced these calls. These are state actors, regional organizations. This particular quote here is from the UN Secretary General and the ICRC President jointly, kind of saying that we need to establish specific prohibitions and restrictions on autonomous weapon systems. And you see here just a couple of these declarations that have been happening in South America, in the Caribbean, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, and in Europe earlier this year. And I think these calls really originate in a governance gap in the field of military applications of AI. So there are currently no specific legally binding international regulations of AI technologies in the military domain. Of course, I don't have to tell you that. International law applies obviously also to this particular type of weapon system, but I think we find that there are really a number of kind of specific challenges that AI technologies raise that are not addressed in international law as it stands now. So that's why I think we have this governance gap. There have been discussions about potential governance structures for a number of years. So the most prominent of these, also one debate that Dustin has followed, is the group of governmental experts on autonomous weapon systems at the UN in Geneva. But at this point, this is really at a debate stage, right? So they don't have a negotiation mandate. They have had a discussion mandate in this group for the past 7 years. Some people describe the process as glacial. Some, in terms of the progress rate, some people say it's tectonic, right? So I guess it's even slower than glacial. And I don't want to kind of bash this forum too much, you know. So they are operating by consensus rules, and I think it's also fair to say that they have not been moving forward as quickly as many of us would have hoped, and it's kind of unclear to what extent or when this gap will be filled. So this and in the meantime, so while these conversations are going on, we have a trajectory of militaries developing all types of different weapon systems integrating autonomous and AI technologies in their targeting functions. And I think I'm just showing you this not to kind of advertise these systems, right? But to kind of quite clearly ground the debate in a longer historical trajectory, right? So although we quite often hear about the term AI revolution, right, or the term killer robots, I think this is singularly unhelpful, because it doesn't actually show us this longer historical trajectory of systems that have various types of automation, autonomy, or other predecessor technologies to AI in their targeting functions, and that are very much shaping already how states think it is appropriate to use these technologies. So I've at this point of of the talk, right? So I talked about AI in weapon systems. And basically, I just want to summarize two observations that are kind of leading me to this argument, right? So which is, first of all, this governance gap, and then this development trajectory of systems integrating these technologies already. And I think, given these observations, I want to make two types of arguments. First, that the integration of AI in weapon systems is already changing international norms related to the use of force. And I want to particularly make the case that they are changing norms around human control or the exercise of human decision-making capabilities over the use of force. And then I think I want to also make the point that we can change these, we can track these changes via looking at practices. And here comes the differentiation between the different types of norms that I talked about, right? So I'm going to be departing from the left side of the screen here, so from legal norms. Because, as I just said, we don't have any specific legal norms in place, but I'm going to look a lot at social norms, right? So, which I define here quite broadly as understandings of appropriateness. And these social norms, you would have to think about them as often implicit, not really written down, often not publicly discussed. But I think social norms also communicate what states and other actors consider to be appropriate behavior when it comes to the use of force. And I therefore think we should not only kind of consider what kind of states publicly voice in terms of kind of their positions on the potential governance of AI in the military domain, but we should also look at what they do, right? And this is also my understanding of practices as shaping these social norms is also not a legal understanding of practice, but practices as patterned action in social context. So it's like a sociological understanding of practices that we could be tracking. And then one of the kind of the key kind of models that the AutoNorms project has really been trying to shape is this one, which basically thinks that in order to understand how norms around autonomous weapon systems emerge, we can't just look at these kind of public deliberative processes where states come together at the UN and kind of voice their opinions on regulation pro or con and how this should be shaped. But we also need to look at the development trajectory or the ways that basically the practices of how these states have chosen to design, have chosen to train personnel for, and have chosen to use these weapon systems over quite a long period of time. And I think basically that in these practices of use and of design, we've seen a number of social norms emerging, and in particular, I think a norm of kind of accepting a diminished role of human control in specific use of force situations has been shaped over decades. And then the project really tries to theorize then the dynamic interaction between these two processes. So you see here we have types of systems integrating automation, autonomy, and AI since the 60s. And only since the 2010s have we really had a public debate about this, right? So, when this kind of public debate happens, we can actually see interaction between these two processes. And this is then what I try to summarize here in an article published in the European Journal of International Relations that basically tries to think, okay, so once we have these two processes, the public deliberative one and the practice-based one interacting, what types of different relationships could we think about, and what kind of result would they have on norms emerging from these interacting processes? And I'm not going to talk about this whole table because I think it's going to take too much time, but I'm very happy to share this article with all of you who are interested. But I think in the case of laws or lethal autonomous weapon systems, as you see here on the table, two particular dynamics are happening. So I think we have a dynamic of positive acknowledgement in the sense that basically sometimes states speak about these weapon systems that are integrating automated or autonomous technologies, but they all say, okay, there's always a human in the loop or on the loop in these systems, so there's a human operator making the final choice to use force. So that's why these systems are actually not autonomous weapon systems, right? Because they would be defined by an absence of that human role. So that's why basically the current practices are fine and represent best practices, right? This is kind of the positive acknowledgement that's happening. And then I think the other kind of contradictory dynamic is kind of the fourth one, willful ignorance, because quite often also states choose not to talk about any current systems, but kind of just pretend as if this whole kind of historical trajectory is not happening, or is kind of somehow distinct from what we should be focusing on in terms of fully autonomous weapon systems. Because in a way it's a similar argument, right? So the kind of idea that because there are humans in or on the loop making decisions on the use of force, these systems are not by definition autonomous weapon systems, and so we don't really have to talk about them in the context of these public debates at the UN. And I think because of these two dynamics, what is actually not happening is any really public scrutiny of these ongoing practices and the social norms that they shape. So which has led, I think, to a situation where we actually have potentially undesirable social norms taking shape in these practices that are not scrutinized in these public forums. And I think the example in this case is really that we see that a diminished role of human agency in targeting decision making is being shaped by these practices. So basically, I mean, just to unpack this a bit, so I think that we have found that these kind of practices accept a more passive, right, a less knowledgeable role of humans in specific force situations as kind of appropriate in a sense, right, without really having publicly discussed that. And the project then actually has studied some of these systems that are integrating AI technologies very closely. So I'm just going to talk about one particular weapon system, and then Anna will deliver the second part of the talk, talking about AI and decision support systems. So one of the systems that we've studied are so-called loitering munitions. So you might also have heard about them as one-way attack drones, right? So or killer drones, right? So, if you, depending on which videos you are consuming, the idea is really that studying these kind of actual systems and how they integrate AI technologies can tell us a lot about the direction of travel when it comes to how these systems are used. And I think in this case, we really found that there's a lot of uncertainty around how much control humans really actually exert at the specific point of using these systems. So although most manufacturers will say that these are human in or on the loop systems, if you look closely, they're also sometimes in the same kind of marketing material. They also say, okay, but these are potentially capable of also being used in fully autonomous modes. So then, that of course gives you quite a significant gray zone, right, in terms of what is really actually the quality of human control exercised here. And I should also add that even if you have a human in the loop or on the loop, that doesn't automatically assure a high quality of control. I believe that's something that Anna will be talking about in more detail.
Yes, thank you, Ingvild. So another empirical illustration that we wanted to talk about is AI-based decision support systems. It's on, yes. We've been working on this for the last few months, also considering the increasing reports in the media about the use of such systems. So they're technically not weapon systems, although they're likely to be used together with weapon systems such as loitering munitions, and they're also not fully autonomous. We're talking here about AI being employed at various steps in the process of military decision making, which is obviously a complex and multi-layered dynamic process. So AI-based systems could be used for processing and analyzing large volumes of data, planning military operations, and taking decisions that include decisions on using force and targeting. So the important point here is that AI is not making the decision. It's not a decision system, but it's meant to assist humans. So there is formally a human in control and making targeting decisions. So one example of such system is the so-called Project Maven. It's a US DoD initiative to use computer vision and machine learning algorithms to identify targets in real time based on previously collected data, essentially millions of hours of drone footage, mostly collected in the Middle East. And as you can see here, this is a Bloomberg report. So they kind of describe how this Maven smart system works. So in the interface, so it would analyze the data and indicate via yellow boxes potential targets like ships and military bases, and then blue boxes would delineate no-strike zones like civilian infrastructure. And Bloomberg also reported that the system was used to carry out more than 85 US airstrikes in Iraq and Syria on military targets in February of this year. And these are not brand new developments. Like there's a long history of using computerized and automated tools in military decision making, but especially with developments in machine learning, there are increasing concerns about the exact role of the AI system and versus the role of the human. So the human-machine interaction in those decisions that impact human lives, both combatants and civilians. So particularly we can ask questions about how the information is presented, right? The interface, the data that the system was trained on, considering that AI systems obviously rely on the quality of the data, and warfare is a dynamic environment where a set of data is applicable in one conflict but not in another. Technical malfunctions and different assumptions and biases involved. So for instance, what is called automation bias, when humans overtrust outputs provided by AI systems, even though they know that they're likely to contain errors. And you need to consider how these systems are used in accordance with certain targeting doctrines and rules of engagement, and also certain social contexts. And so we often argue that it's important to see this as a socio-technical system where the technical and the social interact with each other. And the reported uses of systems, AI decision support systems by the Israel Defense Forces kind of provide an illustration of these different concerns. Especially systems that are called Gospel and Lavender. These are the two most discussed systems. Again, we don't have access to how exactly these systems were used. We have reports that suggest that the use of such system allowed striking an unprecedented and higher number of targets in Gaza. And this incredibly high number of targets struck in a small amount of time, especially at the end of last year, raised a lot of concerns about the room left for human judgment. And these accounts suggest that human operators would approve targets based on the use of these systems within a very short time frame. So there are concerns about this being essentially a rubber stamp approval without the necessary context-dependent critical assessment about the consequences of these attacks, which is required by international humanitarian law. So it appears that targeting decisions that involved such systems were made in haste, and it looks implausible for all of these decisions to have been cleared by legal teams, at least according to legal experts that I've spoken to. And obviously this raises questions about the quality of human involvement in decision-making that affects the lives of civilians, especially in Gaza. So as we argue in most of our publications, is that even with a human in or on the loop of military decision-making, the use of AI technologies raises a lot of legal, ethical, and humanitarian and security concerns. So it's really not only about autonomous weapons or so-called killer robots. Of course, they're important to discuss, but actually most militaries right now are not looking to replace humans with autonomous systems. They're interested in so-called teaming technology, AI technologies with humans, and this is so I have this quote by the scholar Charlie Carpenter, and I really like it because she writes that the risk is not about killer robots replacing humans, it's about human decision-making becoming too robotic, essentially transforming human operators into killer robots. We argue that there are changing dynamics of human-machine interaction in warfare and in military decision-making on the use of force, and it's important to examine them and, of course, address them via efforts in global governance and global norms. Now, what are the prospects? What are the ways forward to address all of these challenges? As Ingvild already said, there is no specific international regulation beyond existing IHL, and the main question about, especially at the UN debate, has been on whether there needs to be new international legislation to address all of these challenges of human-machine interaction. And this debate has been mostly ongoing at this UN Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons in Geneva. Yes, and since 2016, there's this group of governmental experts on lethal autonomous weapons has been meeting usually twice a year in Geneva. And as Ingvild already said, the mandate is not to negotiate any new treaty or legislation. And there's been quite a lot of frustration, especially with campaigners, as you can imagine, that are arguing for a ban on fully autonomous weapons. And the consensus rule doesn't really help. So some actors have been actually arguing to move the debate into the UN General Assembly because the decisions are made by majority voting. And so you can see end of last year, the first UN General Assembly resolution was adopted. It's, as you know, it's not legally binding document, but it is quite significant due to the voting pattern. So it was I believe it's 164 in favor, 5 against and 8 abstentions, if I remember correctly. So, it's kind of also symbolic in a way because it was an overwhelming support. But while there is deadlock at the United Nations, there have been other initiatives. So, for instance, some states and also organizations like NATO have been publishing their codes of conduct and principles and declarations on so-called responsible AI in defense. One of these initiatives is the U.S. Political Declaration on Responsible Military Use of AI and Autonomy, also non-binding, but it has more than 50 states right now that endorsed it. So that's often seen as a kind of some sort of progress, and it also goes beyond weapon systems. And as Ingrid already mentioned, there's been a number of regional efforts and national efforts. So last year, conferences in Costa Rica, Luxembourg, and the Philippines. This year, Sierra Leone and Austria. And there are these responsible AI in the military domain summits. So this is an initiative that started last year from the Dutch and the South Korean governments. And the first summit took place last year in The Hague, and this year there was one in Seoul. And this framework of responsible AI broadens the debate beyond just weapon systems. So it would actually, encompass like AI and decision support systems and various other uses of AI in the military domain. So in that sense, it is quite useful, at least in my view, and a step forward because we get to discuss many more issues, and especially issues along the life cycle of the AI system, and not only at the point of use. Let's say if it's a weapon system, like how, when it was used to select and attack a target, but with a broadened framework, you also get to consider what happened before, right, at the research development, then testing, evaluation, and then deployment, and then let's say either review or reuse or discontinuing the system. And other initiatives, it's quite challenging, right, to move forward, as you can imagine, in any kind of set of top-down initiatives. So one potential way forward could be to complement the top-down process with bottom-up approaches and processes like setting standards. And here we can highlight the work of the IEEE Standards Association. So actually, Ingrid has been co-chairing that whole process. So that this is just published very recently, a framework for the human decision making through the life cycle. So this is also adopting a life cycle approach on strengthening the human role in defense applications. And perhaps in a more self-promotion, we're actually we just launched this new project called Auto Practices, where we have for objective to co-create a toolkit of best practices on strengthening human agency in the use of AI systems in the military. So together with stakeholders from different regions of the world and different backgrounds as well, including legal, of course. That's our objective, and that would be published next year. So I hope that this gave you an overview of the topic and also of our research. And please do visit our website and reach out to us if you're interested or have any questions.
Thanks very much. I now open the floor for a half hour of discussion of the research and the implications and the questions and other issues concerned. Please.
Hi, thank you guys both for sharing your research with us. I was just wondering if you could briefly speak to some of the weapon systems you noted on there, such as the Iron Dome. There's a couple other notable ones that I think in layman's terms are viewed as like defensive or reactionary weapon systems.
Yeah.
Do you view the use of AI targeting systems in these defensive/reactionary systems as a good thing? Yeah. Do you think like there should be a binary that exists between aggressive or reactionary systems?
And I'll collect a few questions, and then if that's okay, and then we'll move forward.
I see that you look at 4 countries, particularly US, China, Japan, and Russia. I would be interested to look at whether have you found some kind of convergence or divergence in their approach as well? Like, do you see the practice being converging in terms of, and the attached question with that would be, if you look at that vote as well, it's very surprising that India votes against it and China abstains. So
Yes.
it's very interesting. And out of all the countries, like eight are abstaining and 4 are voting against. Is there something like which you have read into this while your research comes out as to why this has happened from these 2 big countries into this technology?
Would you be able to speak briefly to what you expect war to look like in 20 years, what the responsible use of AI would constitute in war in 20 years or 10, just the near-term time horizon, and then, in your opinion, what the worst-case scenario is for the proliferation of this technology in the near term?
So I'll turn it over for those 3 sets of slowly rolled grenades.
Yes.
Do you want to start? I can start. I will start with the defensive offensive systems. I mean, that's a very typical question, you know, and I'm not saying necessarily that defensive systems are problematic per se. They are included in that table because they are, I think air defense systems in particular, or guided missiles, are some of the earliest integrations of automation and autonomy in weapon systems, you know. So I think that's why they're quite crucial in understanding where the practices are and how they have been shaping and warm around the place of the human, really. And so I think that therefore they're important to study, right? So even though we might not consider these systems particularly problematic per se, they are also contributing to shaping that norm, you know, that then also travels, you know, with the way that these technologies are integrated in other types of systems that are maybe more problematic in terms of their use. I mean, I think in terms of the problematicness, if we're talking about stationary systems, you know, that are used in a defensive setting, of course, that is less problematic in a sense, but at the same time, it's always a matter of perspective, right? So that's why I always shy away from kind of purely defensive or purely offensive applications, because as we know, like the systems can be perceived in defensive and in offensive ways. So I'm just putting them out there to kind of to have a full view, right, of actually what are the practices that have been shaping up, you know, and what does this then mean for emerging social norms. Around the convergence and divergence across countries, it's, I mean, what we found is that the 3 big developers of the technologies, or I mean Russia, okay, this is a case that maybe Anna can speak to in a bit more detail, because she has been working on that case in particular. There's quite a bit that unites them in terms of general skepticism, right, towards any binding regulation. I think we find in general that the practices seem to travel a lot with the technology, so these kind of general finding on diminished role of the human is something that appears no matter if it's, for example, an air defense system that is being used by the US or an air defense system that is being used by China or by Russia, because it is something within the logic of that system itself, right? So of course that doesn't mean that these countries have in any shape or form the same type of targeting doctrines or rules of engagement, but there are some things that are similar in terms of how the technology is supposed to be deployed and working in coalition with the human operators, and I think that's quite disconcerting in a way, right? Then I think the particular positions of the countries, there's a lot to unpack there, right? So we've had 2 successive postdoc research just working on China, but there's also always, and I should also put this out there, there's always we have to be transparent about what we can know and what we cannot know, right? And in some of these countries, there's more information available because the countries have different legal regimes, right, and different transparency issues. I mean, for example, on the US systems, you will always find more information than you will find on the Chinese systems, right? Even if you're able to read Mandarin and read all the Chinese language sources, right? So because I don't have to explain to you why this is the case, right? But I think even despite this kind of problem of source accesses, I think it's actually there's quite a lot you can find through these open access types of information. But I will leave the third question about the next 20 years.
Okay.
I can also comment on that if you want me to.
No, I will maybe just add on the convergence that I also have an article on US and Russian discursive practices, and yes, there's actually quite a lot of convergence in terms of at least the official discourses on how AI is framed as a competition. Obviously, it's important, like regulation will prevent, winning this competition. For the US, actually, it's more of a competition with China, and in the Russian discourse, it's with the US, but still the main themes are there. So this is interesting, and on why different states vote, especially at the General Assembly. It's like different institutions responsible for different forums, right? Like whether it's MFA or like at the GGE, for instance, it's a number of different experts, legal experts, technical experts that form a delegation, and then at the General Assembly, it's depending on which institutions have more of a role to play. So these are dynamics that I think you can look at this case by case, and I don't necessarily, I haven't really looked into that much into detail into that specific vote. It's really hard to make predictions on what's going to happen, next month with AI more broadly, or next week even. I would say that for me personally, what the debate would kind of benefit to focus on is this human role rather than the AI systems, and they constantly evolve and develop. But what's the role of the human in this interaction? How do we prevent the humans from becoming these killer robots through their interaction with AI? And what are acceptable norms of human involvement, human control, human agency, whatever you want to call it. There are multiple terms for that. But I think this is, for me, that should be the focus of the conversation, at least right now in the near future. The worst case scenario, I guess, I don't know, maybe it depends, but you can argue that, of course, a lot of humans are inhumane. Indeed, you can see it across armed conflicts and war zones around the globe, that a lot of people are losing or did lose their humanity. But I still think that humans at least have the option of making those reflections and choosing the right way, the humane way, and AI systems are programmed in a certain way and they don't have that option to make those reflections. So the worst case for me would be, for this option to make those reflections to be delegated to a system that is just programmed on data.
Sorry, I left the hard question for you, but I can maybe add one thing to that.
I'm sorry to put you all on the spot too.
That's fine. But I think it will be easy to answer your question, saying this is all inevitable, right? If we look at Ukraine, if we look at the last couple of years, there seems to be a proliferation trajectory, right? And this is also what many states around the world would say, so this is coming, right? The only way for us to react is to invest in our own systems, right, and develop our own systems. But I really think this is not necessarily the case, right? So I think AI is not some kind of natural force that happens to us, right? But it's something that is human constructed and human designed, right? So I think that there's a great importance to be aware of the choices, right? So that have to be made to lead either to a kind of apocalyptic future or to a more reasonable future, right? And I think the choices are definitely still there to be made right now.
We'll do another round.
Hi, very interesting. I was wondering if you could speak to the industrial development of some of these technologies, maybe in a couple key countries like US, Israel, Russia, China, or just generally what are the patterns of the private firms? Is it very much like state-led? Is it very opaque? And also, is there any sharing of technology between the different countries, or firms that sell to more than one?
I know you both touched on this a little bit, but could you talk about maybe the increase or prevalence of false positives in military systems? I know that's something that people in other industries are dealing with, but do you think it's more impactful or more prevalent in military systems because of the changing or the dynamic nature of the military? And on a similar note, do you think it is important to reduce bias, or do you think the bias is actually helpful in this case because it might give more humanity to the data?
Thank you so much for the presentations. I was just wondering if in your evidence you came across anything that suggests that the complicity of big tech companies who provide the architecture to these militaries to conduct warfare using AI, and to what extent they might face or should face liability for their complicity in what may amount to crimes under international law. And what is the information situation like? Is there information asymmetry? Do these militaries have exclusive knowledge on how these are used, or are big tech companies just doing business and turning a blind eye as to how their tech resources are being used?
Okay, so we'll take those three. That's right.
Yeah, maybe I can start with the false positive questions. I think that is a key concern. I think that has been a key concern ever since even the early stages of automation. Just to give you one example, the Patriot missile defense systems, right? It has been embroiled in, especially in the second Iraq War, in these kind of false positives and cases of friendly fire, right? Sometimes also the system, I don't want to say hallucinating because it was an automated system. It's not a generative AI system, but basically identifying targets that were not even there, right? So there are many reports about that already with these kind of predecessor technologies, and I think given what we know about how AI technologies function, I don't think these have gone away, right? So I think there's a lot of work there, right, around how these systems actually calculate their target profiles, right? So what falls within the target profile, right? How discerning is that, right? And in a way, there always will tend to be a higher rate of false positives, right? Because you want to avoid the false negatives, right? Especially from a military perspective. And I think that's so problematic especially if you think about these systems not being used as kind of on a one-to-one scale, but across very, very many different types of the branches of the military, very many different types of operators. And then if all of these systems, right, are kind of networked and have these kind of problems going on, I think that's very concerning. In terms of bias, although the debate is already kind of 6-7 years old in terms of military applications of AI, in some cases it's also very shallow still. And I think bias is one of these issues where it actually is quite shallow. There are colleagues at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute who are just now have a bigger project going on algorithmic bias. And I think that will be a much awaited contribution, because at the moment we only have a couple of op-eds of people working on this, So I think this is kind of just one of these areas where much more research is needed, and where the debate about civilian applications of AI is much more advanced, right? So then in the military context. Yes, I'm just kind of trying to think the industrial development question. I think it's a bit like, I think the basic truism in this, right, is that the innovation sources come much more from the private sector than from the states themselves, right? And that is also the case for military applications, right? So that, and you see it also in terms of who are the companies, right, that are talked about in the media in terms of who's providing these systems. Quite often they are not even the big tech companies or not traditional defense manufacturers, but they are these kind of tech startups, like if you think about companies like Anduril or Palantir, which until a couple of years ago nobody had heard about them, right? And suddenly they're everywhere, right? And they have big contracts coming in from all kinds of different sides. So I think that is, and there's more recognition around this type of actors, also across all the different countries, I think, because of course these were just US examples, but you find similar types of actors, and about how these actors are financed, what their normative positions are, right? So we just talked about this over dinner, actually, so it's although it's a rather unsavory topic, but yes, I think it's where maybe the focus originally was really on this kind of big tech and the traditional companies. It's more these very disruptive, smaller scale players that at the moment are really shaping the conversation, and not necessarily in very positive ways.
Yeah, I think I wanted to add on that point, like the industrial development, I think it depends. So for instance, in Russia, it is very much state-led. Right now, the startup scene is just basically, very bad. Mostly due to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And here, it's also important to differentiate between the statements made at the official level by, let's say, the president or any other officials. And saying how Russia is, on the way to becoming an AI leader, etc., and then looking at the reality. So it's important to map out also these differences in development. And regarding the private sector, I think, so you mentioned big tech, but as Ingvild said, there's also a lot of other emerging companies that are not classified as that, and that would be kind of either startups or unicorns that are funded by venture capital. And in the US, I'm actually doing a lot of work right now on that and mapping out these different actors. And it's really kind of also as their practices of developing, supplying actually software, but also, let's say, drones to, particular actors, because it's mostly the US and its allies, but it's so developing, supplying, but also these kind of narrative practices that these actors are promoting in the media and in their meetings with in Washington DC or with policymakers, because it appears that representatives of such companies have particular national security beliefs and beliefs on U.S. foreign policy that they are pushing together with their technologies. So I think it's also important to map out all of these activities to also get a sense of what is starting to be considered more appropriate in terms of social norms on uses of AI in the military, especially as there's so much money going into that sphere, and that includes DoD contracts being awarded to Palantir, Anduril, Scale AI, etc.
Thanks very much. So I'm going to collect all the remaining questions. We won't have time to answer all of them, but I would like to put them forward so that we can have them sort of aired, because we only have about 11 minutes left. So if you have any questions, just raise your hand and we will get to it. If you can articulate them succinctly, that's always welcome.
So I have more of a political science question. Is that how do you think AI has affected the domestic politics of these countries? This autonomous technology, are they particularly inclined to be accepted and supported by one party than the other? Do they have some sort of political impact on the country? And especially is view regarding war, and this might connected with broader political issues?
Thank you all for being here this evening. Within the context of opposition to the use of autonomy, be it in the weapon systems or the decision-making system, is there a convergence or a more successful argumentative point that you've found opposing those, be it a moral question, be it is there empirical data that these are less accurate, or is it sort of just the heebie-jeebie Terminator feeling? How does that opposition really be articulated?
Given perhaps human psychological propensity that you mentioned to sort of rubber stamp autonomous weapon system decisions, what methods of human participation with these systems do you find to actually be the most concrete in terms of facilitating meaningful human control?
Thank you for a fascinating presentation. Does the Council of Europe's new global treaty on AI have the capacity to contribute to the development of norms, also when it comes to the military application of AI?
My question is about the distinction of this from drone technology in a couple of ways. One is whether the way that social norms and social acceptance of drone warfare is distinct from or similar to what you're seeing, the proliferation and changing social norms and acceptance of AI, and whether we can really distinguish the two on the receiving end of the person who is being bombed or experiencing a drone above them 24 hours a day, and whether they think that's piloted remotely or by AI or not, and whether it might be useful as an inquiry about whether we need to bundle those two together, and whether you all considered bundling those two together as thinking about changing norms for both. And part of the reason is, I'm hearing this remoteness of like you get from somebody pulling a trigger face to face with someone to somebody pulling a trigger remotely to someone programming something to do that to boxes on a screen. And maybe those last two steps are actually pretty close together.
Based on my limited knowledge of foreign affairs, I think there was a good amount of international cooperation on nuclear norms because of this idea that if we don't figure this out, we're all screwed. Do you see any sort of that feeling coming up with superintelligence in AI or AGI?
Yeah, it's mostly been encapsulated into this, but there's like a highly technocratic discourse around AI that obfuscates even the possibility of like publics engaging, right? And yet also you have, T-1000 cutouts at conferences, right? And then perhaps one of the most promulgated images in sci-fi is like the killer robot, right? So I'm wondering kind of bivalently, one, whether or not this technocratic discussion around the legal regulation of AI or so-called AI is preventing the opinion of global and state publics from entering in. And insofar as publics at the state and global level do articulate opinions, do they get incorporated into predominantly state level norm setting in international law? And are you guys even tracing that?
The last one I'd add is just, how do you deal with the double black box problem from a methodological perspective? By double black box, in this sense, I mean the encasing algorithmic opacity in military secrecy. And so if there's, I know we only have, and I really want to stick to time, we have 7 minutes, so you can't answer all of those, I'm sure, or if you, I wouldn't say you can't, but I invite you to reflect on the ones that you may have some observations on first.
Yes, okay. Well, I'm just going to pick and choose, so, but if anybody wants to talk later, thank you for all of these really great questions, it's a pleasure to get so many interesting questions. So I'm going to pick up the Council of Europe question, because I think that the particular treaty is a very interesting one, but it also, again, doesn't speak to defense applications, and I think that's quite typical. So the strongest governance frameworks that we've seen evolving, also the EU's AI Act, for example, explicitly or implicitly, and depending on the case, right, say that they don't apply to defense applications of AI. And I think that is very unhelpful. I can see where it's coming from, but it's very unhelpful, right? Because in the case of AI, we're not dealing with civilian AI or military AI. It's the same type of technologies that is being used in different contexts, different applications. So I think if we would have greater convergence between the civilian and military process, that would be much welcome. Because as I also responded earlier on, quite often the civilian discourses are actually much more advanced and deeper than in the military domain in terms of the technology and its capabilities. And I just want to pick up the drone warfare point as well, because I actually started my journey into this topic by looking at practices of drone use, and how they are impacting use of force norms. So I think there is a very clear trajectory. it was very clear, especially in the beginning of the international debate around these systems. So many countries, especially global south countries, still reiterate, right, so that there is a connection, right, between the type of practices connected to drone warfare and what we're now seeing with autonomy in air and weapon systems. But I feel that over time this has become more and more marginalized. Yeah? And although I think, as I said, there are global south coalitions, right, who keep trying to put this back onto the agenda. But I think it's also caught up in this general tendency that I witness, at least at the UN in Geneva, of this particular forum, to kind of avoid really talking about current systems that states are using, right? And I think that almost applies to, so because nobody wants to have their system scrutinized, but of course, if we're just going to talk about this as if it's a science fiction topic, that's also not going to help, And so there's a lot of politics, I think, around the drone comparison, But you're completely right, I would say.
Okay, I have 5 minutes. So yes, I think there is an increasing discussion about this AGI, let's say, fear or risk or existential risk. However, this is quite problematic because this whole discussion overshadows the so-called more mundane risks of AI that are happening on a daily basis that affect people's lives, and of course in the military, but also in healthcare, in law enforcement, etc. This is kind of related because sci-fi obviously gives the impression, or kind of reinforces the fear surrounding killer robots or artificial general intelligence. And this is a problematic because it takes away the attention from things that are less, hyped, but are creating concerns on a more, but lower level, but very important level. And in terms of public opinion, also this ties into the opposition to autonomous weapons. There's obviously a lot of different arguments and concerns, legal, ethical, and security perspective. In the military, a lot of actors would say that they're not interested in using non-reliable systems. But when it comes to public opinion, actually there are studies being done on that, not from us, but I would say that actually, like the campaign to stop killer robots, let's say, and other civil society have been pushing this idea. This goes against human dignity and the violation of human dignity, but this appears to be an argument that doesn't really resonate with the public, at least according to the studies available, and it's actually very much kind of, it depends, and as the usual academic argument. That's the when studies ask, why people are against autonomous weapons, is that mostly is because they're if it's in a scenario where they're less precise than remotely controlled drones. But when asked about this is a violation of human dignity, most in those surveys people are like, this is, it's this kind of, I think this all ties into the types of imagery and the types of narratives and discourses that actors, specifically, campaigners, but also academics and researchers should be using to get more attention to this issue. And finally, on the types of methods of human participation and in decision making involving AI. So this is actually what we're trying to work with our two new projects, is making this more concrete in terms of what does it mean in practice to be responsible, accountable, transparent, etc., and to what kind of role the human should play, for instance, in terms of training and education of military personnel that are using those systems, to what extent they should be aware of the effects of the system in a certain context, or the type of data that the system has been trained on, so things like that. And so stay tuned for the results of our project.
So I'd like to thank Professor Buda and Dr. Nadabietza for joining us, and thank you all for your active participation as well. If you're interested in certain legal aspects of this, the Code of International Law and Armed Conflicts, we also do research related to various aspects of what we've called war algorithms in the past, but various uses of AI-related techniques and methods in armed conflicts. So thank you all very much for coming tonight, and I hope you just get home safely. Thanks.